1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. So this week and next week we will be talking about Elijah. Ahab told Jezebel that all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel, sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord, to take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again, but the angel of the Lord came a second time and touched him again and said, "Get up and eat. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Then he went on the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "Why or what are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take away." The word of the Lord. This is an interesting story by itself, isn't it? Elijah is a prophet of the Lord. Elijah comes into the story of 1 Kings in chapter 17, and he leaves the story in 2 Kings chapter 2. Overall, he's only in 8 chapters of the Bible. And yet, his influence and his presence looms large in the history of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, and even to this day. This man, this prophet, who was but in 8 chapters of the Bible. And I say that because whenever I've studied or thought about this prophet Elijah, I've always thought about him as this great person, this great man. And so I always imagine him being at least in half the text of the Old Testament, because that's how much strength he comes into this. But he's only in 8 chapters. And yet his influence speaks volumes. I think on a side note, if I wanted to preach on that, I would say the length of time we spend with someone doesn't mean that we have been influential. The influence and the length of time don't always have to equal. The blessing that we are to someone shouldn't matter how long we spend with them. It should be the impact of what we say, of how we act, of our integrity and strength to help them through. There are people who you might meet that you're only with them for a little while, and yet your presence influences them for the rest of their life. But that's not the direction that I'm taking the sermon. This text is difficult because there are at least 4 or 5 different ways to take this text and to preach it. So I decided to focus on the fear part. To focus on this part because if we read just the story, it seems like an okay story. He was doing something, then this person said, "I'm going to get you," and he decided to run, and he wound up under a broom tree where someone wakes him up and says, "Eat so that you can have energy for the journey." Then he goes and he hears the voice of God in the cave, and it's an interesting story unto itself. But it's not just the story that makes sense or that doesn't make sense. See, for many of us, we come to a moment or a situation and we're afraid, and then that dictates what we do next. The fear dictates where we go, how we do it, how we react. what we do, how do we respond. Fear does a very powerful thing in our lives. And here we have Elijah, a prophet of God. Here we have Elijah, a person who in the chapters prior to this one did a couple of amazing things. He challenged the God, little g God, who had taken over Israel. This God was Baal, the golden calf, the god of fertility. And he challenged that God in the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. That's kind of unheard of. And normally, if you challenge someone's God, that would lead to death. But he challenged him and said, I challenge you to this. I will close the skies and not allow it to rain for a significant amount of time. And if indeed Baal is the god of fertility, the God who gives the harvest, the God who provides harvest, then opening the skies would be easy, wouldn't it? But because God said it would not rain, God, the God of Israel, said it would not rain. There was a drought for 3 years. And in the midst of this drought, where people started to suffer, where the water was becoming scarce and the land was getting drier and drier, in the midst of that, Elijah met up with this widow woman and her son. And the little bit of oil and the little bit of flour that she had never gave out. For 3+ years, they picked water and oil from the same 2 jars. They picked flour from the same jar. And there was always stuff in it. There was always oil. There was always water. There was always flour. He even raised the widow's son from the dead, proving that God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the real God. And yet the people still had a difficult time. So he challenges the God of this fertility, Baal, straight on and says, I challenge you. I challenge you to build an altar and put a sacrifice on it, but don't light it on fire. Let your God light this. So whichever God lights the sacrifice truly is God. And so they build their altar, they put the calf on it, and they wait, and they call, and they pray, and nothing happens. And Elijah does the same. He builds an altar. He puts the calf, he puts the sacrifice on it. Then he tells them to put water on it. Then he tells them to put more water on it. Then he prays, and God sends fire from the sky, and it consumes all of the altar. So Elijah is doing some pretty amazing things. God is doing amazing things through Elijah. So you would think that this would instill confidence in someone like Elijah. Because I know if God brought down fire when I prayed for it, I would be pretty confident that God is with me. I would be pretty confident that God listens to me. I would be pretty confident that God is here with me. So I feel like Elijah has had this opportunity. Elijah has seen the evidence of God, has touched the evidence of God, has been witness to the evidence of God, more tangible than any of us can claim. And yet, after he has called down fire, after he called the people to repentance, after he called them to eliminate the prophets of Baal, the queen Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to rid the world of you. And immediately, Elijah flees. That kind of adds a different perspective to the text that we read today, doesn't it? The story we read, or the text that we read today, it was interesting because, he fled. He was afraid, so he fled. But now when we put it into context of all that has happened before and what God has done with him and for him and how he has evidence of God in a very tangible way, to realize that he still turned around and ran away shows you the power that fear can have over someone. Shows you that we're not as strong as we think we are. If we allow fear to come into our hearts and to take control of us, it does. And fear is a very powerful thing when given the opportunity. Fear caused this person, this man Elijah, this prophet of God who has seen and done so many amazing things in the short time we've read about him, to turn and flee. And then we hear that the voice of God says, "What are you doing here?" And he goes into a little diatribe that may be called a little bit of a whiny sounding thing. I'm all alone. No one worships you anymore. Now they're trying to kill me. Even though in chapter 18, the chapter right before this, he's told by Obadiah that 100 of God's prophets had been put into a cave to protect him. So he has at least 100 people with him. So he's not alone. He just came from Mount Carmel, where he called down fire, and the people, all of the people who were there, repented and came to God. So he's not alone. He also has heard about others, or will hear about others who have never bent the knee. And he realizes, or he doesn't realize, I should say, that he is not alone. This is the problem with fear. Fear blinds us. Fear prevents us from seeing what's really happening. If Elijah would have taken a moment and taken a step back, he would have remembered that there were at least 100 other prophets that were still alive and still worshiping and have never bent the knee to this fake God. If he would have taken a moment, he would have realized that all of these people had just repented and done what God had called them to do. If he would have just taken a moment and not allowed the fear to take over, he would have realized that he was never alone. He went running with a servant, so he had at least one servant who was with him. And he ran and went under a broom tree. And a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the mustard seed and the plant that grows and the tree that grows from it. This is the same tree, a broom tree that grows in the same vein. And he just wanted to die. He was done. And so we realize a couple of things. Not only is he afraid, but he's also probably depressed and struggling. He's burnt out. He's been through all of this. He's been through so much. He's gone through this journey, and he's just done. We reach those moments in our life. We reach moments of just being done, where we can't do the things that we've always done. For me, I was 18 years in accounting. And even though I was doing or being a part of ministry, I wasn't doing it the way I had needed to. And I knew that, but I tried to avoid it as long as I could. But I knew that I was burnt out from doing accounting when I couldn't balance the same reports I had been doing for 18 plus years. The numbers just didn't want to add up. The things that I did forever just didn't want to balance. It was time. I couldn't see beyond what was in front of me anymore. I couldn't do the work the way it was intended to be done anymore. I was burnt out. We reached that moment. And we keep pushing through and we keep trying and we keep trying. But when you have nothing to give, you can't take blood from a stone. Elijah has reached this moment. And I know we've all had a moment like this. We've all reached a point where it's just like, I can't anymore. I just can't. I try and I try and I try. And it's kind of like a locomotive just spinning its wheels on the rails. Nothing is happening. Nothing is moving forward. What is next? And that is the key. What is the next step? As I said before, Elijah is someone who we think about in the Old Testament as a powerful prophet, so he must have been there for so long. There must be so many stories about him, but there are only 8 chapters because the work that he was called to do was so intense and so much that 8 chapters was sufficient to give his story and to allow him to bless generations of Jewish people and now generations and millennia of Christians. But he burnt out and struggled. Where are you on your journey? Where are you on your journey of life? Where are you in work, in family, in all that you have to do, all the things that are necessary to be done? Where are you? Are you burning out? And we have to be weary of this because when we get burnt out, that's when fear can take over. When we get burnt out and weak, that's when fear can take over our perspective. As I said, Elijah had all of these things going for him. He had just called down fire. That's amazing. And yet the next chapter, he's running for his life afraid, saying, God, just take me now. I'm done. He was burnt out and done. Your journey is longer than you realize. And if you are at that moment now, I ask you to please take a moment, take a step back, and try to get a clear perspective on what's going on. Because you are going to continue. And if you continue to be burnt out, life is going to be about depression and struggle and anxiety. Life is going to be about the weight of the world on your shoulders. Life is going to be about all of those things that are the things that cause you harm and difficulty. If your sole focus is work, work will weigh you down. Where do you get your joy from? Where do you get your encouragement from? Where do you get that which brings life into you? If all you're doing is giving, where and when are you receiving? Fear can come in and take over and blind us to those around us. Blind us to our family, to our friends, to those people who encourage and help us so that we feel that we are alone. But I'm here to remind you and to tell you that you are not alone. There are people who love you who are around you. There are people who care for you that are here with you in church. There are people who you may not realize pray for you on a regular basis. There are people who lift you up before the Lord because God has placed you onto our hearts. Because God knows your situation. God knows where you are and how you got there. But now it's up to you. Are you willing to listen? And as the chapter continues, God comes to Elijah and he changes his call. It seems that Elijah had been called to strictly focus on the king and the queen and bring God back into Israel's focus. But after being burnt out for doing all that he did, his new call, his new path, his new way was to anoint his successor who will carry out the plan, and to anoint those who are to continue the work that was already started. He didn't have to do all of the work anymore. I think he probably didn't have to do all of the work to begin with, but we do that sometimes. Quite often we take it all upon ourselves and then we can't handle it. So what is your next step? What is your next road? What is the call that God is placing on your life now? You've done what you've done, and you've been where you've been, and you've done all the work that you've needed to do, and it's brought you to this point of burnout. But now, where is this road that God is calling you to? How can you get onto that road? Where is the road that God is calling you to now? I encourage you to come before the Lord. I encourage you to listen and to study and to read and to figure out where it is that God is calling you. If your road or the road that you're currently on has come to an end, as if you're standing on a crossroads on what are the next things to do, if you're burnt out because you're trying to continue to spin your tires in the same place, open your heart, open your mind, open your ears, open your eyes, and don't let fear guide your steps, but let God be the one in control and in charge. Because fear, more often than not, is very, very difficult to deal with. More often than not, fear is illogical. More often than not, fear prevents us from doing the things that God has called us to. And if we think about it, most of the things that we regret are the things that we were afraid to try. Man, if only I would have. Man, I should have when I had the opportunity. I could have been a contender. Fear prevents us from moving forward. So my prayer and my hope is that today we allow fear to fall to the wayside. And God, open our eyes to see the road that's before us. That God, open our ears to hear where God is calling us to. That God, open our minds to understand what it is that we are being called to. And that God would open our hearts to receive all of the blessings that the Spirit has for us.